more that this Western music and Western media in general made you feel differently about your own situation and perhaps about Westerners. It just totally, depended too on the person. I mean, obviously, the official line of the state was that Western ideals were bad, capitalism was bad, all that. But how each individual person sort of internalized that, it's going to be different from person to person. Yes?
Someone mentioned when you talked about the space program, when Sputnik 1 went up, a very simple satellite, it had a small, it had a small radio transmitter. It transmitted in the 15-meter ham band, simply in Morse code. Hi. Hi. Well, I was a ham at that time. Hey, you could listen to it. I mean, you didn't need a heck of a lot of power, to go from space down. It was interesting. You could call it propaganda, but all it said was hi, hi, hi. No scientific experiments. Later Sputniks did.
Yeah, well, that's interesting.
Nice. Yes. I have a question that ties in with this. At least in Western literature, science fiction, once you strip away the science fiction aspect of it, is heavily concentrated on social and political commentary. It's a really good vehicle for exploring inequality, exploring authoritarian governments, etc. Did Soviet science fiction actually go in that direction as a subtle and almost unintelligible social commentary, or was it all about the science?
Oh, definitely. I mean, in the Soviet Union, that type of storytelling was very popular. Like fairy tales were huge in the Soviet Union, and fables, things like that as well, because you could obscure your meaning enough to avoid censorship. So definitely, some Soviet science fiction touched on that 100%. Some of it was just lighthearted, like, we go to space, it's really awesome, type stuff. Like I said, their obsession with it just was very pure in a lot of ways, and it really was just about extolling the virtues of a project that they were very proud of. So, there's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, though. It was such a huge field. It was such a huge phenomenon that I think you could almost go through science fiction and find it to say almost anything you could possibly say, because it was just that popular. Do you have a question, ma'am?
I guess I'm just curious, what was your drive to study this, and how, as far as the language, do you have any stories on the language barriers or things like that?
So I first got interested in Russia because my mom is a Dr. Phil fanatic, and she was obsessed with Dr. Phil. And on Dr. Phil, right when I graduated high school, were all the stories of people who were adopting children from Russia and not enjoying that and sending them back to Russia. And I thought that was really heartbreaking, and I wanted to work in international adoption. And then my first day of college, Russia outlawed USA adoptions. So I just stayed in college. I stayed in my major. I knew I liked it. And I started to become really interested in the Soviet Union because, first of all, I just kind of think it's genuinely interesting because it's such a weird period of history in the scope of the whole world. But even more so, I thought that it really had applications to what was happening today. I truly do think that it's impossible to understand what's going on in Russia politically, socially, everything, if you don't understand the history of the Soviet Union. As for why I got interested in the culture, I just was really tired of reading about what Stalin was doing. I wanted to read what normal people were doing, and so I started getting interested in culture in graduate school, and I loved how no matter what field you're in, when you start talking about culture, you really start feeling like you understand it. You can read, you can read a whole book on Napoleon and you never really understand what was going on in France. You just know what was going on for Napoleon. But you read a book about French peasants and you really do feel like you know these people and you know what they experienced. As for language, I am a miserable Russian speaker. I can write Russian really well, I can read Russian really well, but I had such a bad accent that my Russian teachers would openly mock me. So I never got very confident in it. I went to Russia and I brought a little tiny flip notebook, and every single interaction I would write down what I wanted to say and just hold it up to them, and they would say back to me, and then I'd be like, that's pretty much how I got around the whole time. It worked well enough, I'm still here. And I found that, but like anywhere you go, if you have good spirits about it, Russian people are as forgiving as any other, group of people about you being absolutely terrible and making a total laughingstock of their language with your accent. But yeah, Russian is hard, but it's very rewarding. It's in my opinion. I took Spanish in high school for 4 years, and I only learned mi permite ir al baño. Yes, sir.
Did Orwell's 1984 get into the Soviet Union?
I'm sure it did. Like I said, by the time even like Brezhnev was around in the very early 1970s, there was just such a sophisticated black market. Almost anything got in. It was called Thomasdot. The Samizdat was stuff that was in the Soviet Union, like Solzhenitsyn that was outlawed, and Thomasdot I think was what came from outside. And yeah, they brought in all types of things. There was like a sophisticated black market that was traded mostly in favors, not actual money, and in connections. Like, oh, I know somebody who's the boss of this store, and you'll make a little bit more money if you work there. Like stuff like that. And so, and then obviously actual money as well, or just stuff that you had that the other person wanted. But almost anything got into the Soviet Union. It's just a matter of like how widely it got around. I don't think 1984 in particular was one of those books that they were really seeking out at any point to really destroy in particular. And that might also speak to, it might just be one of those things like we were speaking about before, it might just be just obscure enough that they thought it was maybe not anything to worry about. But yeah, that's what I remember about 1984, and I remember Animal Farm being a little bit more hotly contended because that's pretty blatant. Yeah. Does anybody have any more questions? Yes, sir?
I think I read Karl Marx in high school and hated it, but I'm wondering, is it worth rereading? Are there some points there that today especially, would it be worth going through it again?
I would say always reread it if you're even thinking of rereading it. About almost anything. But I did. Now there's so many. Like you can read. Like a little. I think when I started graduate school, they just wanted everyone to know. Like, okay, we all know what communism is, right? And we read like a little article by Marx. It was maybe like 10 pages. So he has a lot of stuff out there that's a lot more digestible than like Das Kapital or like the Communist Manifesto. So what I would say is read an article by Marx, and if it doesn't make you want to tear your hair out, then read the Communist Manifesto. But I will say, I think almost everyone in this room could tell you what communism is. I'm sure you could tell us what communism is. So it's not going to be a whole lot of new ideas. Yes, ma'am?
I was lucky enough to go to high school here, and with Louis Chernyshek, he taught Russian. I took 2 years of Russian in high school. And part of the class he did was through works of literature like Chekhov, Cherry Orchard, smaller sections of the huge tomes that were all nice and depressing. And he was very hated communism, but he made it so you make up your own mind about it. But the most controversial book he had us read was A Clockwork Orange, which